Hello, 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 and welcome to English Learning for Curious Minds by Leonardo English, the show where you can listen to fascinating stories and learn weird and wonderful things about the world at the same time as improving your English. I'm Alistair Budge, and today we are going to be talking about a tiny Mediterranean island called Malta. It is a place I called home from 2017 to 2024. So you could say that this is the result of 7 years of research, conversations, and observations. There is so much to say that I've actually split this into 2 episodes. In part 1, in this episode, I'll talk about Malta in general, and in particular, what it is like as a place to learn English. And in part 2, I'll go a lot deeper into some of the things that you probably wouldn't notice as a tourist, and talk about my experiences on everything from government corruption, Malta's relationship with the EU, and the concept of Maltese identity. Okay then, let's get right into it and talk about Malta. In December of 2016, my then fiancé got a job offer. It was for a job at the University of Malta. Neither of us knew much about Malta or had ever been there. All I knew was that it was very hot. A boy from my school used to go on holiday there, and that it had become a destination for British stag do's and school leaving parties. My fiancée knew it was just south of Sicily, and her mother was worried that we would be living in some deserted, dusty village, surrounded by only goats for company. The contract was only for 1 year, but we both thought, why not? A year is only a year. If it is a total disaster, then we can return to London, and you never know, it could be fun. This was almost 8 years ago now, and a few months ago, we left Malta for good. So I thought it could be interesting for me to tell you about my observations and reflections on life in Malta, and how the country has changed even in the relatively short time that I was there. After all, I get emails all the time from people who are considering going to Malta to learn English, or even moving to Malta. So if you are that kind of person, I hope that this will be helpful. And if you are listening to this in Malta, or if you have already spent time in the country, well, perhaps it will be interesting for you to hear someone else's point of view. Of course, this all comes with the caveat that it is based on my experience. Malta might be a small place, but it is varied, and everyone will have different experiences. Now, for those of you who know absolutely nothing about Malta, let me start with a few basic points. Malta is a tiny country in the Mediterranean, about 100 kilometers south of Sicily. Contrary to what many people think, it isn't part of Italy, nor is it part of the United Kingdom, although it was under British rule until 1964. One of the main relics of British rule is the reason that you might have heard of Malta, or have been there. English is an official language, and there are 35 English schools in Malta, welcoming tens of thousands of students every year. So, to answer a question that I receive almost on a weekly basis, should I come to Malta to study English? Clearly, the answer is, it depends, but here are some things to consider. There are broadly 3 categories of people who come to Malta to learn English. First, the largest category is of the French, Italian, or German teenager who comes for a week or 2 in the summer as part of a large language group, and returns home with a sore head, some serious sunburn, perhaps some formative romantic experiences, and an ever so slightly improved understanding of what a phrasal verb is. This is the largest category in terms of student numbers, making up almost 50% of all students coming to Malta. But it is especially concentrated in the summer, so outside of July and August, you will be unlikely to find these types of students in your class. The second category is people who are studying at an English school for purposes of immigration, with most of these students coming from South America, predominantly Colombia. The primary purpose for most of these students is to emigrate and live in an EU country with better economic opportunities. So most will come, study English at a school for a few months, and then get a job working in a bar or a cafe. If you are from Colombia, you probably know already that Malta is a big destination for Colombians. But if you didn't, it might surprise you if you arrive in Malta and hear Colombian accents on every street corner. In fact, there are so many Colombians now that at some English schools, they are not allowing more Colombian students, so that there is a proper mix of nationalities in the classroom. I have a good friend in Malta who runs a business exclusively for Colombians coming to Malta to study English. And I can tell you firsthand, it is a big business. There are lots of Colombians studying English in Malta. And then the third category of learner that you will find is the adult learner who is taking a course for an extended period for work or professional reasons. Someone who needs to quickly upskill their English and is often being sponsored by their employer. There are lots of people from places like Japan, Korea, and Turkey in this category. People who will take a career break to focus on their English. And these kinds of people, in my experience at least, are by far and away the most dedicated students. Clearly, not everyone fits neatly into these three categories, but this is a helpful way of thinking about the different types of people that you might encounter in an English school in Malta. So, what factors should you take into consideration if you are thinking about whether to come to Malta to learn English? If you are looking for an immersion English experience, and you want to speak English from the moment you wake up until the moment you go to bed, then Malta is a good option. Of course, you can also have this in somewhere like London or Oxford or New York or Boston or Sydney, but those places might be a long way from home, and they are certainly more expensive. The cost of learning English tends to be lower in Malta than in the UK, North America, or Australia. So if price is an important factor, if you are paying for it yourself rather than your employer, Malta could be a sensible choice. And another, perhaps blindingly obvious thing to mention is that Malta is a Mediterranean island. And if you like the sun and lying on the beach, Malta ticks a lot of boxes. The official tourist board boasts that the island has 300 days of sunshine. And this is not a lie. For much of the year, it is simply glorious. Summers are incredibly hot, too hot for my taste, and the winters are cold because most houses have no heating. But outside those periods, you will be blessed with blue skies and wonderful warm sun. And because it is such a small place, you will never be much more than 20 minutes from the sea. The third factor to consider, which might be an advantage or a disadvantage, depending on what you're looking for, is that Malta is, as I've said already, a tiny island. It's 316 kilometers squared, and although it is incredibly densely populated, it has a small town feel. There is a lot to do for a small island, but at the end of the day, it is a very small place, and if you're looking for a vibrant cultural scene with different plays and shows to go to every single evening, and opportunities to go on expeditions in the country every weekend, Malta probably isn't the right place for you. But one of the benefits of it being this small, and of having such a high concentration of foreigners and people learning English, is that it is incredibly easy to meet people and make friends. There are meetups, sporting clubs, and in my experience at least, it is pretty easy to take part in almost any activity you like and make new friends along the way. It's also very easy to get to almost any European destination. There are cheap flights all over Europe. So that is a major advantage, especially for non-Europeans whose study visa would allow them to travel all over Europe. So, to summarize, if you want an international atmosphere, reasonable prices, and like the idea of spending time on a Mediterranean island, or even using it as a launch pad for exploring the rest of Europe, then I definitely recommend you consider Malta as a place to study. Now, what about Malta itself from a non-English student perspective? The first thing to mention is that Malta has been experiencing an economic boom over the past 15 years or so, created principally through attracting online gambling companies to the island, as well as selling citizenship. I'll tell you a bit more about my opinions on this and experiences of it in part 2. But from a practical point of view, this has resulted in the country developing at breakneck speed. It's very noisy, there is constant construction, a lot of traffic, horns beeping, and especially if you come from a more rural environment, you will probably be struck by how many people there are, especially in the main tourist areas, and how crowded it feels. And one thing that might surprise you coming to Malta is how few Maltese people you might come across. The population of the country, according to official statistics, is more than 1/4 non-Maltese. So there is one foreigner for every 3 Maltese people. This is especially noticeable in touristy areas, where you can easily go from cafe to supermarket to shop to hairdresser to restaurant to bar, and not a single person will be from Malta, or will be able to speak a word of Maltese. So, where are all these foreigners from? Historically, most foreigners in Malta used to be from the UK and Italy, but in recent years, Brits and Italians have been overtaken. There are still plenty of British and Italian people, but now 3/4 of all new immigrants to Malta are from non-EU countries. These tend to be people from places like India, Pakistan, and the Philippines, who have often been drawn to the country to work in hotels or restaurants or in construction by the promise of a simple visa process, decent wages, a good work-life balance, and the possibility of sending money home every month. The reality is that Malta simply doesn't have enough Maltese people who are prepared to do this hard manual labor, and so the country has turned to imported labor to fill the gap. And as a result, the population has increased dramatically, increasing by 34% between 2002 and 2022. Now, what does this mean? On a practical basis, along with very favourable legislation that encourages people to buy apartments to rent out, the price of rent has shot up, more than doubling even in the 7 years that I lived there. And now, Malta is quite an expensive place to live. In a desirable area, it would not be so unusual to pay €2,000 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment. And it is very hard to find an apartment anywhere on the island for less than €1,000 a month. And salaries have barely increased. The minimum wage is just under €900 a month. So for people employed in low-skilled jobs, the situation is not particularly rosy. And this is especially true for foreigners, who are more likely to pay rent than Maltese people. So the result is that many foreigners simply leave. According to a recent report, half of all foreigners who come to live in Malta leave within a year. And as you've heard by now, I have also left, although I did stay for 7 years, 6.5 years more than the average foreigner. So, do I regret it? Not at all. Like any country, there are plenty of things to complain about, but overall, Malta has many advantages. It has great weather, beautiful villages, the sea, the sun, very friendly and welcoming people, and I am incredibly grateful for having had the opportunity to call it home for a not insignificant period in my life. So, if you have the chance to visit Malta, or even to study English there, my advice to you would be the same as I thought over 7 years ago now. Just do it. It's a Mediterranean island. What's the worst that could happen? Okay then, that is it for this little taster of what it is like to live and perhaps study English in Malta. There was far too much to put into one episode, so keep a lookout for part 2, where I'm going to go a level deeper and talk about political corruption, fraud, the EU, and what it means to be Maltese. And if you haven't had enough Malta yet, we do have other episodes on this unusual little country. Episode number 143 is on the Great Siege of Malta, and episodes 306 to 308 are a 3-part mini-series on the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, and episode number 358 is on how Malta became an online gambling hub. So, if you haven't listened to those yet, well, they are there waiting for you. You've been listening to English Learning for Curious Minds by Leonardo English. I'm Alistair Budge, you stay safe, and I'll catch you in the next episode.